Welcome to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are Catholicism.org and Reconquest.net. My email address is bam@Catholicism.org. I can also be found easily on Twitter @brother_Andre and on Facebook. The topic this evening is Heretics, Apostates, and Schismatics, oh my. This is intended to be a continuation of my discussion with Mr. Ryan Grant, Latin translator extraordinaire and managing editor of Mediatrix Press, who translated and published the book On the Church Militant from the De Controversiis of Saint Robert Bellarmine. I said it was intended to be that because due to some technical or perhaps not entirely technical difficulties, I am unable to get Mr. Grant on the Skype line right now. If it should happen that he contacts me during my first segment here, I will just sort of cut the first segment a little short, and then we will resume with Ryan Grant. So I named it that, Heretics, Apostates, and Schismatics, oh my, obviously for some comical value, but also in order to get across the fact that tonight we were going to discuss how those particular categories of people are not members of the Church, according to Saint Robert Bellarmine in the book that we are discussing. So again, if it should so happen that that Ryan contacts me while we are recording this session, I'll sort of wrap things up here with my general opening remarks, and then we will go to him. Otherwise, I am now winging it, and I am going to talk about the Catholic Counter-Reformation, or I should say it's got two names, and it's got two names for very good reasons. The period under discussion, which is the time roughly beginning at the time of the Council of Trent, which lasted from 1545 to 1563. Beginning around that time, the Catholic Church responded to the challenges of a doctrinal and disciplinary nature that came our way, came the way of the Catholic Church through the so-called Reformation of Martin Luther, John Calvin, and company. The various Protestant revolutionaries that are historically often called reformers. We contend, of course, that they did not reform anything, so we don't think they're worthy of that name. But the Catholic Church's response to that challenge is sometimes called the Counter-Reformation. Now, there are reasons against using that name. And the principal reason against using that name is it makes it sound as if the Catholic Church is somehow against reform, which is not the case, because there have been many, many periods in the history of the Church which were known to be periods of reform, not the least of which is this very period under discussion. But there were previous periods which were also known to be periods of reform or reformation. So that's one reason that the name Counter-Reformation is bad. But inasmuch as the name Reformation stuck to what the Protestants call their little thing, then calling it the Counter-Reformation simply says that we oppose that. So just going by sort of conventions of language, because Reformation stuck, then it's not so bad to use the term Counter-Reformation. But there is another term called Catholic Reformation, which is another name for this epoch under discussion, beginning again roughly at the time of the Council of Trent, which began in 1545. Why would we call it the Catholic Reformation? Because in addition to responding to the heresies of the so-called reformers, the heresies of Martin Luther and John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli and the Anabaptists and all of the other different reform groups, the reason that we, in addition to responding to them, there was also the much-needed work of reform. So this actually agrees with one of the contentions of the Reformers, which is that the Catholic Church was in need of reform. Of course it was in need of reform. The Catholic Church, the true church, is often in need of reform. This is one reason we have ecumenical councils, of which there are 21. And before the time of the Council of Trent, there had been numerous councils beforehand. If going off the top of my head, Council of Trent was council number 20. Yeah, Vatican II was Vatican II was 21, Vatican I was 20, Council of Trent would have been 19. So before the Council of Trent, we had 18 councils, and most of them were called with some agenda of reforming something or other, and this is very necessary in the life of the church. You have periods of decadence and so forth that need to be fixed, need to be corrected, new disciplinary things need to be addressed, as well as doctrinal matters, heresies that need to be corrected, and orthodoxy maintained. The business of the Council of Trent actually undertook both the Counter-Reformation aspect of attacking the false doctrines of the so-called Reformers, and it also undertook the agenda of authentic reform. And in what could we say that the Catholic Church needed to be reformed authentically? Well, in a lot of things. First of all, we can talk about non-resident bishops who were bishops of their different dioceses or archdioceses who did not reside in those dioceses. And it was a tremendous deprivation of the faithful, for the faithful and the clergy in those places when the bishop was not resident there. There was a corrupt system of multiple benefices, meaning that for every office in the church, one gets a stipend that goes with it, a salary, so to speak. And people would arrange to have multiple benefices. You'd be abbot of this monastery, abbot of that monastery, bishop of this diocese, bishop of that diocese, canon of this cathedral chapter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you didn't actually do the functions that were obligatory for that office, but you raked in the bucks that were associated with it. Now, this is dirty Catholic laundry being aired out. These are facts of history. And if we choose to whitewash these things, then shame on us, because Catholic Church history is not simply hagiography. The history of the Catholic Church is not just the history of the lives of the saints. You can read the lives of the saints in every century and get a fairly impressive history of the church if you read very good, beefy, informative, historical lives of the saints. But if all you read is the holy stuff and the edifying stuff, then it's good to be edified, but you're leaving off the fact that there are a lot of shadows as well as bright lights in the history of the church. And you might not be equipped to address the objections of people who know about those shadows. And you can say, yeah, but you had popes that did this, and you had little papal bastards running around the Vatican and so forth. And this pope and that pope had mistresses, and this one and that one was homosexual or whatever. This stuff's true. It happens. It's a fact. And we don't want to whitewash this history of the church. Some of our best Catholic historians have told the story of the church, warts and all. And that really is how it ought to be told. I'm not saying we need to teach children this, but I'm saying that at a level when you become adult in your faith and adult in your approach to the study of history, you should read about it, warts and all, at least to know that the warts exist. You don't have to go into all of the disgusting substrata of the warts in order to know that warts are there. Now, you're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network, radio the way it should be. We're talking about the history of the Catholic Reformation, or the so-called Counter-Reformation. There are some very important aspects of the Counter-Reformation that frequently get overlooked. It is a fact that the Counter-Reformation took far too long to get underway. Why? Well, think of the government. Think of our modern government here in the United States of America. We have a corrupt government. We have a bloated, fat, corrupt bipartisan system of financial non-accountability, of people living off the fat of the government not knowing its place, of the government being a persistent warfare state, of people in both parties getting money from special interest groups that they assist depending upon how they vote in Congress or how they act in their various official positions in presidential cabinets or so forth. In other words, you've got a very corrupt system. And if you don't think that this is a corrupt system, corrupt government that we're living under, well, maybe you ought to look at the news a little bit. So we have a very corrupt government. Now, is it likely that that government is going to want to reform itself? Are the people who are doing these things likely to want to change when they're doing it all to their advantage? Given the tendencies of human nature, the obvious question, the answer to that question is no. Same thing in the church. Okay, you've got a human element. Yes, the Holy Ghost is the soul of the church. Yes, the church is the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Yes, the principles for reform are always there. The grace is always there. That's a given, but that does not mean that humans will avail themselves of that grace. And therefore, when you read the history of the church, you will find that there are times of epic failure in the history of the church at doing certain things. And you will find that there's massive corruption on a wide scale in the clergy or in religious life, in the civil ruling class, and in various strata of the church. And that would include, of course, the laity as well. Now, having said that, we also have saints. Having said that, we also know that there is holiness that's to be observed in the church throughout every era. And when you read the history of the church and the lives of the saints, you will realize that the ones who were calling for reform at the time that the church most needed it were precisely those people, the saints. And you would have people like St. Catherine of Siena, who, on the one hand, said that the Pope was sweet Christ on earth, and at the same time would write to a pope in her own lifetime and say, I can smell the stench of the sin on the papal court all the way from Siena. And she's writing, of course, to the Pope who's living in Avignon at the time, which he shouldn't have been. He should have been in Rome. In doing this, St. Catherine of Siena shows us that, yes, we have incredible and profound respect for these offices in the church, the priesthood, the episcopacy, and especially the papacy, but all of them as of divine foundation. But at the same time, it is not a superstitious worship of men. It is not an oversight, deliberately overlooking the sins of men and the corruptions of men and saying, no, it's perfectly okay for bishops and priests and popes to do things that are immoral and unjust and not faithful to their state in life or to their vocations. No, I mean, to do this is to be naive at best and dishonest at worst. And that's not what the religion is. We have to be honest about the religion. So this is a fact of history. You have corruption in the life of the church, and you have also great saints who are calling for reform all throughout the history of the church. And those are the ones who lead the movements away from corruption, and always, though, in the name of Catholic orthodoxy. And this is what makes the Catholic Reformation distinct from the Protestant Reformation, so-called, which sought to reform things, but in a way that was entirely heterodox, and which instituted heteropraxy. Martin Luther, of course, besides instituting heresies, besides attacking Catholic doctrines that were perennial doctrines, besides doing all that, he also instituted disciplinary practices, or rather violated perennial disciplinary practices in the church, not the least of which was his own vows as an Augustinian friar and the vows of the woman whom he took to wife. By the way, it was an invalid was an invalid marriage because Catherine von Bora was no more in a position to marry than Martin Luther was, they both being vowed to celibate chastity and not able to contract the sacrament of marriage because of it. So on the other hand, when you look at the great saints of the Catholic Reformation, like Saint Robert Bellarmine, like Saint Robert Southwell, like Saint Peter Canisius, and I'm just naming Jesuits, but I certainly don't mean to get stuck in a Jesuit rut. Any of the great saints of the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation, they reformed the Church always heading in the area of orthodoxy. Completely faithful to perennial Catholic doctrine, they said, yes, we need to address these areas of corruption. We need to address the non-residence of bishops. We need to address monks and nuns and priests not being faithful to their state in life, not being properly formed for their state in life. You know, one of the reasons that's often given for the existence of the Catholic, Counter-Reformation, Protestant Reformation, is that there was a tremendous amount of corruption on the part of Catholic religious monks, nuns, who were not faithful to their vocations. They were not properly formed. And the same thing with the clergy, the priests. And to what do we owe this? Well, one of the theories is that we owe this to the fact that the Black Plague had killed a disproportionate amount of priests, of religious, of monks, of nuns, because they were working with the plague victims. And the Church, therefore, lowered her standards for clergy and religious. And this prepared, or rather failed to prepare, a generation of properly formed clergy, episcopacy, the bishops, and also religious, monks and so forth. And the Church, having lowered her standards, you had a lowering of the bar, which helped to facilitate a system of corruption. You had less prepared people. The Counter-Reformation shows us an intense focus on formation, disciplinary formation, ascetical formation, the formation of the intellect, and so forth. So this is a very, very real, very, very important aspect of the prehistory to the Protestant Reformation. And these aspects had to be addressed at the Council of Trent. Now, I have good news for you, and that is that my winging it section of this show is brought to an end at the end of this first segment because Ryan Grant has officially contacted me on Skype. I was worried that maybe he was caught in Turkey during the coup d'etat, but apparently he's still safely in Washington State. So we're going to close the first segment now. We'll be back with our guest, Ryan Grant. This is Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. Radio the way it should be.
You're listening to Reconquest with Brother Andre Marie, seeking that which was lost and fighting for it. Exclusively on the Veritas Radio Network's Crusade.
Welcome back to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are Catholicism.org and Reconquest.net. You can email me for ideas, suggestions, questions at bam@Catholicism.org. I'm also on Twitter at Brother_Andre, and I'm easily found on Facebook. With me now, via Skype, is Mr. Ryan Grant, the translator of many books by Saint Robert Bellarmine, including the one we're discussing now, which is On the Church Militant, and the managing director of Mediatrix Press. Good evening, Ryan. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening, brother. Glad to be here.
All right. So I thought we would hop right in, continuing on our discussion of On the Church Militant. And I've got some very specific questions that are intended to guide us through the discussion of the subsequent chapters that we left off on. And last time we finished talking about the unbaptized, and tonight we begin with on heretics and apostates. And I thought the best place to start with that, I mean, we hear these names bantered around, but the best place to start with that is to ask you to define these terms. What did Saint Robert Bellarmine mean by the term heretic? What did he mean by the term apostate?
Well, a heretic is somebody who has failed, because remember, just to recap from the last time, that he defines a member of the church as someone who has the correct, right external profession of faith, as well as is united to all others with the same profession of faith in the communion of the sacraments, and united to their head, the Pope. All right, the Roman Pontiff. There's this center and glue of unity, so to speak. And so that so a heretic has failed in the profession of the faith, and as a result, he has, it comes from the ancient Greek word hereseo, which means I choose. So you're choosing not to believe what the church believes. So then Bellarmine defines this very clearly as denying a revealed article of faith, something that's already been revealed. Okay, so if you deny something that you find, for example, in a theological manual that you find maybe all consensus of theologians teach on a certain subject, and you deny it, it might be rash. You might have a note of Irenaea that is erroneous, but you would not be heretical in that sense, which is a violation of the. You would lose the virtue of faith, basically, if you knowingly, obstinately professed a heresy. Right, and so he starts off showing that namely, Scripture shows what we understand about heretics. That in 1 Timothy 1:19, it says that certain, as Bellarmine comments on that, saying certain men are shipwrecked in regard to the faith. For in that passage, it understands heretics by means of the metaphor of a shipwreck. After being broken from one part of the boat of the church, after which they sink into the sea, which also is meant by the Lord's parable of the net which is torn before the multitude. Besides, to Titus he says, quote, after a heretic has been given one or two corrections, knowing that he is subversive, who is of this sort, he has been condemned by his own judgment. There the apostle commands the bishop that he should avoid heretics, because certainly he would not command it if they were within the church. For a shepherd ought not avoid those whom he has care of when they pertain to his own flock. Okay, so that's actually a very useful thing to remember, is that so by the tripartite definition of what makes one a Catholic, a heretic is not. Therefore, he's outside of the church.
So he has violated the external profession of the faith. He's no longer externally professing the Catholic faith. Of course, internally he's not accepting with his heart either, and externally he's professing some doctrine that contradicts the revealed truth of the Catholic faith.
Right. So somebody who contradicts, the theologians have like a universal proposition. Say, for example, on St. Thomas asked the question, if you move the Eucharist, do I move Christ's body? And, he says, actually, no, I don't move Christ's body, because the Christ's presence, Christ's body is in heaven, but is mystically coterminous with the host, but it's not localized specifically to the host. The host are it's just the substance, it's just the accidents without the substance that indicates the presence of Christ's body, according to St. Thomas and the Scholastics. So if somebody went around and denied that, right, it might be rash, but again, it's not heretical, because this has not been revealed, and really it couldn't be revealed because it's a secondary object of infallibility. It follows from revealed articles of faith and logic, but it's not in and of itself revealed, right? So there's no way you could be held to that on the grounds of heresy. But on the other hand, if you deny that the Eucharist really is substantially Christ's body, then that is heresy. It's already been revealed. So that would be, for example, somebody who obstinately did this, knowing that the church taught contrary, saying, well, I don't care. I don't believe that. Well, that makes him a heretic.
And the idea that that the word heresy comes from the word to choose is significant here, because it's an abuse of one's free will. So you're willfully choosing to accept with your intellect something alien to the faith, And we have this term today, I mean, it's been around for some decades now, a cafeteria Catholic. One who says, well, I'll take one from column A and one from column B. I don't want that stuff about birth control, and I don't want that other stuff about whatever the doctrinal issue is that makes me uncomfortable. That concept, doesn't the concept of heresy sort of wrap up with that modern concept of a cafeteria Catholic because it's a matter of choosing?
It does in many respects, in as much as, especially, I mean, you're failing in the profession of the faith, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's certainly, because in the case of a heretic, he has chosen to do other than what the church does. He's chosen to believe other than what the church has revealed. So that, from it basically shown that Christ revealed, because the church herself doesn't actually reveal it, but Christ and the Spirit of truth does. So the heretic then, he's obstinately chosen. He's no longer disposed to receive the virtue of faith because he's choosing the doctrines of men, so to speak, as opposed to divine doctrine.
Okay, so and Saint Robert Bellarmine says they're not part of the church because he shows that bishops are advised by Saint Paul advises either Timothy or Titus to avoid heretics, and he said, you wouldn't tell him to avoid one of his own faithful. A bishop shouldn't do that. A pastor shouldn't avoid his own flock. So this is a proof that these people are outside, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So the reason, my next question was, why can't they be part of the church? But you actually answered that because they fail to meet the definition, that tripartite definition of what the church is. They exclude themselves on the first note there, being the profession of the same faith.
And that's now today there are people who would argue, oh, well, no, they're not really outside the church because they're baptized. And once baptized, always baptized, because they still have that indelible character. And I think we spoke about that last time.
A little bit,
yeah. It's a very, it's a very common thing. So, for example, if somebody gets formally excommunicated by they argue, well, the 83 Canon Law says that it doesn't put you out of the church anymore. Well, maybe in terms of the canon, but morally it does, because you have been excluded from the communion of the sacraments, mm-hmm. right? And you're not under obligation to go to Mass. You're actually forbidden, right? At least in many cases. Sometimes they used to have the distinction of tolerandi and vitandi. Those have been gotten rid of. But so the same thing with a heretic too. It may be that he's baptized, and therefore he has an indelible mark on his soul. But that's kind of like the brand and sheep, to show that they belong to this fold. It shows that you belong to the one Catholic and Apostolic Church. And that mark will be present in hell. But that doesn't mean that the church is in hell, that you're a member of the church in hell, right? Because that would obviously be absurd. And therefore, if you're outside, you're having this indelible character doesn't actually show per se that you're in the church, because you can't see it. I can't see it. Nobody can see it except the demons. And so,
if we were to say once Catholic, always Catholic, the logical consequence of that is that these perennial concepts that were used by the church in her canon law, in her ecumenical councils, by the fathers and doctors of the church, of heresy, schism, apostasy, are basically meaningless terms.
That more or less is true. And again, as Bellarmine shows in this very work, the consequent would be that the church was in hell, right? That the people in hell were members of the church because they had the mark of baptism.
Now, okay. So we talked about what a heretic is. What is an apostate?
An apostate is somebody who has publicly basically defected from the Catholic faith and sworn off and joined another sect. So on the other side of the laity. So an apostate has basically said, well, the church, it's very closely related to schism, and the actual distinctions here kind of get lost. But apostasy essentially is throwing off the faith. So one might be a heretic. The distinction comes into this. So a heretic will be, for example, he's obstinately denied an article of faith, but he still thinks he's in the church, or still would stop in the church. This is what I believe. But an apostate has actually, sworn off. It may not actually, include heresy. Usually does. It's hard to imagine in cases where it wouldn't. But the apostate essentially is he's left the church. He's left the unity of the church. So not only the profession, but the unity with the head.
The modern concept of apostasy, I believe, includes the idea of a complete repudiation of the Christian name, doesn't it? Is that something?
I believe, yeah, that's where the new canon law takes it, and it's probably the case. For Bellarmine, it's more distinct, as in their time, it's repudiating the Catholic name. So if you'd gone over to be a Protestant, you wouldn't just be a heretic, you would also be an apostate. If you were first Catholic and then went to the Protestants, you're both a heretic and an apostate. But if you were born in a Protestant sect, you were for them a heretic.
Okay, so
it would only be eternally heretical.
The modern apostate, according to the current law, as I understand it, I'm no canonist, but as I understand it, according to the current law, to be an apostate, you'd have to renounce the Christian name utterly. So you'd have, if somebody became a Muslim or a Jew or
exactly.
A pagan or a complete atheist or agnostic or something, that would be apostasy. And
that's correct.
And again, the origin of the word apostasy, right? It's a heretic is one who chooses, right? What's an apostate? One who
an apostate, apostasia in Latin, and it comes from a Greek. It just means departure, repudiation, and in Greek it would actually be a repudiation of your city, because in classical Greek the whole concept of worship and religious worship is bound up. The liturgia is actually bound up completely in your city-state, your polis in classical Greek, and the veneration of the particular gods of the city. And so that, like in Athens, just take Athens as an example, everyone can grasp, most people can grasp. Athena is the main goddess of the city, and there's also temples, of course, to Zeus and to others, but Athena is this particular patron of the city. And then for the normal things that are done in Greek culture, your other gods and whatnot. So the liturgia that you rendered to these false gods in classical times was part of your patriotism and your citizenship. We talked about this a little bit with St. Cyprian and the issue in 250 with the persecutions of the Romans, right? And that business in the last episode. So it's a similar thing here with the ancients. So that term in Greek just basically means renouncing your homeland. Your city-state. So the way it's applied in Christianity, the way they applied apostasia, is that same concept, is that you basically repudiated your homeland.
Now later in the book, so apostates and heretics, it's pretty obvious why they wouldn't be considered in the church. What applies to a heretic applies a fortiori to an apostate. But later in the book, he's going to talk about secret infidels, people who have false doctrine, who have renounced the Catholic faith in their hearts, but they would be considered still members of the church because as long as they maintain that external profession of the faith, correct?
That's correct, and that's an important distinction for other matters. And the occult heretic, as the term they use, he's not, has lost the virtue of faith, properly speaking.
Occult simply meaning hidden, right?
Hidden, yes.
Secret.
Occultare in Latin, which means to hide.
Yeah.
And thus we get our derivative into English, the occult. Ooh, spooky music, satanic stuff and everything. That's what everyone comes to mind.
Well, that's why I wanted the clarification, right, so people weren't freaking out about it.
The occult, so to speak, tries to hide itself, right? And so that's why you have that crossover in terms. So so secret heretics, they've lost the virtue of faith. They no longer have it. But they externally, whatever reason, whether it's because of fear, and Bellarmine talks about this later in the book, whether it's because of fear or because it's politically expedient or because if you were a public heretic, you could lose all your business or something like that, you are publicly saying that you're Catholic, even though internally you're not. So therefore, you would be a member of the church. However, you would be a dead member. So you would be adhering to the body of the church, but not the soul, right? And so you would be a dead member who is like the nail, like taking the analogy of the body by which the church is compared. Then you would be like the nails and the hair and that are dead parts of the body. They're not living parts of the body, yet they're there in the body. So that's basically what a dead member would be, somebody who's an occult heretic.
Okay. Now, in the next chapter, he goes into schism. he talks about schismatics not being members of the church. First we got to do an identification. This is Reconquest on the Veritas Radio Network, on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. I'm Brother Andre. We are interviewing Mr. Ryan Grant, the managing director of Mediatrix Press, who translated this wonderful book by Saint Robert Bellarmine on the Church Militant. So in chapter 5, he talks about schismatics, on schismatics. Now, schismatics, of course, are also not members of the church. Define for us what a schismatic is, please.
A schismatic is somebody who might even profess the same faith, but he is, and they have the same communion of the sacraments. However, they have lost the unity with the head. Okay, and so Bellarmine identifies the etymology of the term from the Greek schisme, which means a tear, right, coming out of the verb schizein, which means to tear, to rip apart. And so consequently, schismatics are not in the church, nor are they of the church, he says, because the part that is torn from the body is no longer a part of that body. And this is the reason that Cyprian beautifully says that the church is signified through the seamless garment of Christ, which was not torn, so that we might understand the church can be torn, but not in the manner in which a garment is torn, so that some parts remain equally part of the very same, clothing or garment or whatever. But how a branch is torn from a tree, which dies right away, while the tree lives there. So that's basically so he uses that from Cyprian to give you that idea that the church is one. And so schismatics then, when they tear away, that is, they're not actually part of the church anymore, and so they can't be.
There's a very sloppy way of speaking today, and of course, much of it's driven by ecumenism, where they talk about, the schism in the church has torn the church, so that you've got one part of the church over here that's been ripped off from another part of the church over here. But that is alien to Saint Robert Bellarmine's thought, is it not?
It is, and as much as it actually also, ironically, would be alien to Vatican II's thought, in as much as when you look at Lumen Gentium, and as much as they adopt Bellarmine's definition of the church at Vatican II as well, that they carry in the same distinction. So even though they talk about healing the rifts, it's not clear in Vatican II. It's rather the latter that comes. And of course, I'm not a big fan of Vatican II, right? So I'm not trying to do the whole reconcile everything. I'm just making that particular point that even Vatican II would hold the same thing with regard to schism. They just kind of moderate the language a bit, but the distinctions are still there. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, then, since then, they say, oh yeah, they're two separate things, but you have to remember Christ said, may they all be one. Can Christ's prayer lack effect? Well, no, because you would basically, in effect, do the very thing that he claimed the Protestants did. You would be creating two churches, one where you can believe this and another where you can believe that, because we don't have unity of belief either. One where you can be in union with the Supreme Pontiff and one where you don't need to be in union with the Supreme Pontiff. It's like creating two bodies of the church if one was going to take it in that fashion. And that's simply impossible.
Which is it's a monster to have a church with two bodies. Christ has two bodies now. Right.
That's really where you're getting. It's like, reminds me of something Leo XIII said. He applied it in a different sense. He was talking about the Gallican era and said, the church doesn't have two heads like a monster, but one, right? So you'd say now one head and two bodies. That. That's the problem with the imprecise language regarding especially the Eastern Schismatics, where they want to say, oh yeah, these guys are perfectly, and the Eastern Schismatics, to their credit, a good number of them kind of realize this is just a lot of doublespeak. So the Russian Orthodox are very virulently opposed to ecumenism, as also are the Ukrainian Orthodox. A lot of the Slavic Orthodox churches are very opposed to it, and
the Serbians, big time.
Yeah, they're very much so. And then also the Syrian Orthodox, too, are generally against ecumenism. They support, kind of solidarity, especially in the current situation in Syria. But in the 80s, for example, they were very much opposed to ecumenical efforts with the Pope. So it's so they kind of see what it is. They just have their ecclesiology is a bit different from ours. And, of course, we don't have time to go into that. But they recognize it for what it is. We're not communing with him. Why are they saying we're in communion with him when we're not?
Well, and they don't have the modern Catholic sort of liberal Catholic ideas of partial communion and full communion.
No, at least on that score, they haven't succumbed to that level of liberalism and ecclesiology. So it's simply communion is what it is. And so if we follow Bellarmine, we follow the tradition, and all works de ecclesia follow Bellarmine, as I mentioned, Vatican I and Vatican II also. The magisterium of the Church prior to some of the confusion of today, very clear that there is one Catholic unity. That's what it means in the Creed. There is one Catholic and Apostolic Church. If you have one, that's not in communion with the central head, and in some cases, anyways, not in the unity of the same sacraments, in as much as they claim our sacraments are not really sacraments, and they say theirs are the only ones, and things of this sort. It's like only a partial, materially they have the same sacraments, but they don't believe they have it in common with us.
Yeah. They didn't have the Donatist heresy to contend with in the East, so they never wrestled with the questions that St. Augustine had to deal with, and of course, since most of them hate St. Augustine, they don't want to accept him as its source. Precisely,
which is somewhat blasphemous. And the 14th century Byzantine Thomist, Demetrius Kydones, he's really interesting. He learned Latin because he worked in the Byzantine court, in the Eastern Roman Empire's court in Constantinople. So he had to receive ambassadors, and the interpreters weren't always available. So he went to learn Latin, and he liked it. And he learned classical Latin, and he got really into the whole genre of the language, and so started reading books. He started reading St. Thomas. And he just was struck by how the Latins were far from, at least in theology, were far from barbarians, and were very much different than the Franks and others that they saw in their lands. These were people that were serious people that took on really difficult issues in Aristotle that their best philosophers kind of just left alone. And he was shocked by it.
Isn't he the one that said that St. Thomas, he said, "Oh, Thomas, if only you were born on the other side of the Bosphorus"?
No, that was Gennadius Scholarius, or Gennadius II, the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was, of course, part of a whole circle of Byzantine Thomists that Kydones helped create. So Cardinal Bessarion, for example, is another who did swim across to Rome and whatnot. Gennadius Scholarius had said that St. Thomas only had two errors. One, of course, was the procession of the Holy Spirit, because he didn't hold to that, or he held to the Greek error on that. And the second was on a certain issue that we really can't go into, but it's called Polymatism. And St. Thomas didn't hold to that. So those are the only two places where Scholarius...
The doctrine of Gregory of Palamas, you mean?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so we really can't go into that. We don't have time for the uncreated energies of the light of Tabor. Okay, so... now that we've gotten completely far afield, can we distinguish, I don't think that Saint Robert Bellarmine does this, but Saint Thomas Aquinas, following Saint Jerome and Saint Augustine, distinguishes between heresy and schism in accordance with the theological virtues, and says that heresy is a sin against the theological virtue of faith, and schism is a sin against the theological virtue of charity.
Bellarmine says something similar to that. I'm actually looking through here to find the that particular citation, but he basically says it wounds charity. And one who's a schismatic, Bellarmine, doesn't need to be a heretic, and he may not be at all. Mm-hmm. Although there's an adage of St. Alphonsus Liguori, which is that today a schismatic, tomorrow a heretic. So that heresy is not far off as one goes deeper and deeper into schism, and so that it's not a surprise.
Yeah, it makes sense. Because when you sever yourself off from the trunk, as it were, from the vine, you don't have the sap, and therefore all kinds of horrible things can happen. You've cut out yourself off from the principle of life.
Precisely. Hence the whole day, the schismae, the terror in the garment, that is, the church. And so, in the same thing on the question of schism, applies again with heresy, is that, you might be baptized, but that doesn't mean you're in the church, again, because you don't have that tripartite definition of faith that you would have to have. And so we have, there's a couple objections he actually takes on here. So he says one objection is that the church is a congregation of Catholics, as Pope Nicholas defined, but schismatics are Catholics, therefore they're of the church. So Bellarmine responds, firstly, even if schismatics have the Catholic faith, nevertheless, they cannot properly be called Catholics even if they profess the faith in the Catholic Church. As is clear from the citations we provided from St. Augustine above. We skipped over those to get to here. I say, secondly, this is not the full definition of Pope Nicholas, nor did he mean to define the Church but only exclude heretics from the church. So just as Pope Innocent did when he said that the church is the congregation of the faithful. So that's one. And the next one is that even if schismatics refuse to submit to the Pope, nevertheless, they mean to submit to Christ the supreme head, is what the objection says. And although they refuse to communicate with this church on earth, still they mean to communicate with the church that is in heaven, namely the better part of the church. Therefore, they do not abolish the unity of the church, nor they are likely outside of it. And so Bellarmine responds, no man can be under Christ and communicate with the church who is not subject to the Pope and is not in communion with the church militant, even if he wishes to be. For Christ said, he who hears you hears me. And besides, just as Christ is the supreme head in regard to the interior life, since he breathes sense and motion into his members, that is, faith and charity, so the Pope is the supreme head over the church militant in regard to the exterior life of the doctrine and sacraments. Moreover, the church triumphant is united, nay, more, it is one with the church militant. And so no man can be separated from one without being separated from the other.
Now, one quick question on, actually, you know what? Why don't we wait? Why don't we go to a break and then we'll come back, okay? And we'll talk. Right. I have one question about schism, and then I'd like to move on to the excommunicated before we end the show. You're listening to Reconquest on the Veritas Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network, radio the way it should be.
Your guide to the reconquest of what modern man has lost. Think of it as a roadmap to truth, with a crucifix as a compass. Reconquest is exclusively on the Veritas Radio Network's Crusade.
Welcome back to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. I'm interviewing Mr. Ryan Grant, translator and managing director of Mediatrix Press. And Ryan, we're in the last 5 minutes or so, I have one question for you that I think is important to address about schism. On page 32 of the book, last paragraph of the chapter on schism, he says this: in a similar fashion, I respond with a confirmation. One who separates himself from a particular church, meaning like a local diocese, right? It's a particular church.
That's right.
And bishop, it necessarily separates from the church and the universal bishop being the Pope, right? Then he says this: unless perhaps someone had done it, meaning separated from the bishop, because that particular church and its bishop were heretics or schismatics. End of parentheses. And then he goes on to continue the point. So he's saying that one cannot separate himself from the local bishop without separating himself from the universal church and therefore separating himself from Christ, at least in an ecclesiastical sense. But then he has that little unless perhaps he'd done it because the particular church and its bishop were heretics or schismatics. Now, the million-dollar question in today's ecclesiastical milieu, when you have a lot of people going around saying, well, my bishop's a heretic, and that bishop's a heretic, and he said something horrible, and he endorsed a bad catechism, and he's, got liturgical atrocities all over the place, therefore they're heretics or schismatics, and I'm going to withdraw from communion with them. Now, does every Catholic have the right to do that? Is that in the spirit of Saint Robert Bellarmine?
Certainly not. It's a misreading also of the time. And actually, on reflection, I probably could have put a footnote there. I just hate putting footnotes, changing the work into my own, and then trying to add these explanations. But nevertheless, maybe that one actually merits one. A heretic, or a bishop, who is a heretic, in Bellarmine's understanding, actually have to refer back to On the Roman Pontiff, Book 2, Chapter 30, which actually anyone who wants to do that can do so with your interview with John Salza, which actually was point home really good, the first part of that. So if, so a heretic is somebody can only be so after a judgment of the church. So a bishop cannot be, unless he publicly defected and became, say, a Lutheran. Right, and that's also what's on Bellarmine's mind.
Sorry to interrupt, Ryan. When you say publicly defected and became a Lutheran, that is, I am now aligned with the Lutheran. I'm a Missouri Synod Lutheran now, and I go to that church, and
so it'd be equivalent to saying I am Bishop X, in such and such church in Missouri over such and such diocese in Missouri. But you know what? I'm really a Lutheran now, so I'm going over to the Missouri Synod. And now I was a Catholic bishop and the bishop of this diocese, but I'm still going to try to be, to put it in Reformation terms, I'm still going to be the bishop of this diocese, but now I'm also a Lutheran. I'm both. I'm a Lutheran bishop who's also in charge of this Catholic diocese, and I now own all these churches. They're all under me. That's essentially what happened in the Reformation in various cities where the bishop would go to Protestantism unless the Catholic authorities were able to depose him, if the authorities remained Catholic. If they did not, then they went along too. So this almost happened in Cologne, and actually it was only the work of the German Jesuits, especially, and then St. Peter Canisius, although he was Dutch, but in their work, keeping all the local clergy on the Catholic side, and then Charles V put the pressure on the bishop, and he didn't actually convert, right? So it's that type of scenario where the bishop had declared he was a Lutheran or a Calvinist in some part of Switzerland, for example, that Bellarmine has primarily in his mind. And that would have been painfully clear to his contemporaries, but not so clear to us today. So secondly, a heretic properly understood, and you can go back to St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa on this particular question, he says that somebody, even if he's guilty of the worst heresy, but does not obstinately persist in it and has the will to do what the church does and corrects as soon as he's corrected, was never a heretic. So a bishop who has some concept of that this is okay to believe, right, is not obstinately denying what the church has taught. And so there's a summary judgment of the church against him, and he tries to persist being there and say the authorities helped him, right? Then
when you say authorities, you mean civil authorities. Okay.
So let's say, this hypothetical Bishop X in Missouri said, I'm really Lutheran now, but I'm still going to take over all these Catholic churches and make them all Lutheran. And now we're going to have Lutheran services here, right? And that would be what happened in Bellarmine's time in various places, or Calvinist, or whatever you fill in the blank. And let's say that the cops and the local judges and the federal courts all backed this against the true Catholic Church. You would not be held to be in communion with that bishop, even though the authorities were maintaining him as the bishop of Catholics in that area, even though he wasn't. You would not be obliged to actually hold him as your bishop in that case. If a summary judge, he's publicly defected from the faith, that is an easy one, or he has had a summary judgment from Rome, for example, is another issue. And then a schismatic, same thing. If a bishop should become truly schismatic, and it's one of those schisms, one of those things, you either are or you're not. Right, there's no real in-between for schism. So some people like to use this term materially schismatic, formally, to show you kind of have, schismatic intent, or you're not really. All that is just disobedience, right? But a formal schism, when you're actually schismatic, means you are not in communion with the head, the center of unity, and therefore you cannot be properly the bishop of this particular diocese. So again, you don't have to be in communion with such.
Ryan, we'll have to pick up there next time because we are officially and formally, not just materially, out of time. You've listened to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network, radio the way it should be.